She's not your real grandma." I heard my daughter-in-law yell at my grandson during the family trip. I smiled. I had been waiting for this moment. At dinner, I revealed the heirs to my hidden 50 malor's fortune. She fainted at what I said next. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Lorna, and at 70 years old, I thought I'd experienced every possible humiliation life could offer. I was wrong. She's not your real grandmother." The words sliced through the warm evening air like a blade, cutting deeper than any physical wound ever could. I was sitting on the porch of our rented cabin, watching my 8-year-old grandson Lance play with his toy cars, when my daughter-in-law Lyra's shrill voice shattered the peaceful moment. Lance looked up from his toys, confusion clouding his innocent face. "What do you mean, Mom?" Lyra stood in the doorway, her perfectly manicured hands on her hips, that familiar look of disdain etched across her features. She'd been drinking wine all afternoon, and the alcohol had loosened her tongue in ways that would normally require more careful calculation. "I mean, she's just your father's mother, honey. Not really family like us. She's just here because we have to take care of her." The casual cruelty in her voice made my chest tighten. But instead of the familiar sting of tears, something else washed over me. Relief. After 3 years of careful observation, of deliberate poverty performance, of allowing myself to be treated like a burden, I finally had the confirmation I'd been waiting for. I smiled. Not the forced, polite smile I'd perfected over decades of disappointing social situations, but a genuine, knowing smile that came from somewhere deep inside. The same place where I'd been storing every slight, every dismissive comment, every moment of deliberate exclusion. "Lorna, why are you smiling like that?" Kent, my son, appeared behind Lyra, his voice carrying that tone of exhausted annoyance I'd grown accustomed to. "Lyra didn't mean anything by it. She's just tired from the drive." Of course he would defend her. He always did. Even when she made me sleep on the pull-out couch during family visits because the guest room needed to stay nice for real guests. Even when she served me dinner on paper plates while the rest of the family ate off her precious china. Even when she made subtle comments about how some people never learned to contribute properly to family gatherings. "Oh, I know exactly what Lyra meant," I said softly, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. "And it's perfectly fine." Lance abandoned his toys and climbed onto my lap, his small arms wrapping around my neck with the unconscious affection that only children possess. "You're my real grandma, Nana. I don't care what Mom says." The pure love in his voice almost broke my resolve. Almost. But then I caught sight of Lyra rolling her eyes, her expression making it clear that she viewed even this innocent gesture as somehow inappropriate. "Lance, come inside and wash up for dinner," she commanded. "And don't get your clothes dirty sitting on that old couch." The old couch. The one I'd been relegated to during our 3-day family vacation, while Lyra and Kent enjoyed the master bedroom, and Lance had his own room. The pull-out mattress was lumpy and uncomfortable, but I'd said nothing. I'd learned long ago that complaints only gave Lyra more ammunition. As Lance reluctantly climbed down and trudged inside, I remained on the porch, watching the sun begin its descent behind the mountains. The cabin had been my suggestion and my payment, though the family assumed Kent had covered the cost. Just like they assumed he'd been covering my living expenses for the past 3 years, ever since Henry died and left me with nothing. The irony was delicious. Inside, I could hear Lyra's voice carrying through the thin walls, no doubt continuing her commentary about unwanted family obligations. I'd heard variations of this speech countless times. How difficult it was to have an aging mother-in-law, how some people never learned to be independent, how tragic it was when elderly relatives became burdens on their children's families. What Lyra didn't know, what none of them knew, was that every word, every slight, every moment of deliberate humiliation had been carefully catalogued and stored away. Not for revenge exactly, but for verification. I needed to know with absolute certainty who my son had become and what kind of people now influenced my grandson's understanding of family. The test had been running for 3 years, and tonight, with 8 simple words, Lyra had provided the final data point I needed. My phone buzzed with a text message. My attorney, Richard Morrison, checking in as scheduled. All preparations complete. Are you ready to proceed? I typed back quickly. Tomorrow evening, during dinner, have everything ready. The plan I'd been crafting for months was finally ready for execution. But first, I had to survive one more night of being treated like an unwanted guest in what was supposed to be a family vacation. Through the screen door, I could hear Kent setting the table while Lyra complained about having to cook for so many people, as if feeding 4 people was some kind of massive undertaking. Lance was chattering about something he'd seen on television, his voice bright and innocent, unaware of the undercurrents of resentment flowing around him. I stood up slowly, my 70-year-old joints protesting after sitting too long in one position. 3 years of playing the role of a poor, dependent widow had required more acting skills than I'd realized I possessed. Tomorrow, that performance would finally come to an end. "Lorna, dinner!" Lyra's voice cut through my thoughts, the tone suggesting I was already late despite not being called before. I walked inside, taking my usual seat at the small table. Lyra had prepared spaghetti, serving herself and Kent generous portions while giving Lance a child-sized serving and placing a noticeably smaller amount on my plate. "There's more if you want it," she said with false sweetness, though we both knew the subtext. Elderly people don't need much food anyway. Kent was absorbed in his phone, probably checking work emails despite being on vacation. He'd inherited his father's tendency to avoid family tension by simply not acknowledging it existed. Henry had done the same thing whenever his sister visited and made cutting remarks about my background. Some patterns, I reflected, were generational. "So, Nana," Lance said, twirling spaghetti around his fork with the intense concentration of childhood. "Mom says we might not visit you as much anymore because it's too expensive to drive to your apartment." I felt Kent stiffen beside me, finally looking up from his phone. Lyra's face flushed slightly, caught off guard by her son's innocent revelation of adult conversations. "Well," I said carefully, "sometimes circumstances change, sweetheart. People make decisions based on what they think is best." What I didn't say was that after tomorrow, the question of visits would be irrelevant. Everything would be different. Everything would finally be honest. The rest of dinner passed in relative silence, broken only by Lance's occasional comments about his toys or questions about when we'd be hiking to the lake. I answered his questions and smiled at his stories, storing each precious moment in my memory. These might be our last family meals for quite some time. As Lyra cleared the dishes, making a point of stacking mine loudly to emphasize the extra work involved, I excused myself and stepped back onto the porch. The mountain air was cool now, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of rain. Tomorrow evening, everything would change. The masks would finally come off, and my family would discover exactly who they'd been dismissing for the past 3 years. I thought about the $50 million sitting in carefully managed accounts, the real estate holdings, the investment portfolio that had grown steadily while I'd played the role of a poverty-stricken widow. Most of all, I thought about Lance and the lesson he was about to learn about assumptions, respect, and the true meaning of family. The smile returned to my face as I settled into the old porch chair. Tomorrow couldn't come soon enough. The morning after Lyra's declaration, I woke up on that lumpy pull-out couch with my back screaming in protest, but my mind crystal clear. As I listened to the family stirring in their comfortable beds, I reflected on how I'd arrived at this moment. 3 years ago, when Henry died, I made a decision that surprised even me. Instead of revealing the true extent of our wealth, I chose to hide it, to test, to observe, to see who my family really was when they thought I had nothing to offer except need. Henry and I had been careful with our money for 50 years. While he worked his modest job at the electronics plant, I'd been quietly building an investment portfolio that would have shocked anyone who knew us. We lived in a small house, drove old cars, and clipped coupons not because we had to, but because we understood that wealth grew in silence. When the plant closed and Henry took early retirement, I was already managing nearly $20 million in diversified investments. The inheritance from my aunt's estate, which I'd never mentioned to anyone, had been the foundation. Then came the real estate purchases in areas I'd researched meticulously. The technology stocks I'd bought before anyone understood their potential. The small businesses I'd funded and watched flourish. By the time Henry passed, our net worth had reached $50 million. But instead of sharing this news with Kent and his family, I'd watched his reaction to what he thought was his suddenly impoverished mother. The results had been devastating. "Mom, we need to talk about your situation," Kent had said just 2 weeks after the funeral, sitting in my kitchen with Lyra beside him wearing an expression of barely concealed impatience. "My situation?" I'd asked, though I already knew what was coming. "Your financial situation?" Lyra had interjected, her voice taking on that particular tone she used when discussing unpleasant necessities. "Kent says Dad didn't leave much, and you can't afford to keep this house." I'd let silence fill the space, watching my son avoid eye contact while his wife laid out their version of my future. "We've been thinking," Lyra continued, "maybe it would be best if you moved to one of those senior communities. There's a nice one about 40 minutes from us. Very affordable. You could make friends your own age." Affordable. Translation: cheap enough that we won't feel guilty about putting you there. "And this house?" I'd asked quietly. Kent finally looked at me then, his expression uncomfortable but determined. "We think you should sell it. Use the money for your living expenses." What he meant was, sell the house, use that money to support yourself, and don't expect help from us. I'd raised this man, sacrificed for him, worked double shifts when he needed school clothes or wanted to join the baseball team. And now, with his father barely cold in the ground, he was essentially telling me I was a financial burden he didn't want to carry. The test had begun that day. Instead of revealing the truth, I'd played along. I'd sold the house, just as they suggested, though what they didn't know was that I'd already owned the building where I moved. The rental apartment I now lived in was actually mine, but I let them believe I was struggling to make the monthly payments. "It's so expensive," I'd told Kent during one of his increasingly rare phone calls, "but I suppose I'll manage somehow." The desired effect was immediate. His calls became shorter, less frequent. Lyra stopped including me in family gatherings, claiming they didn't want to burden me with the cost of contributing to potluck dinners. Holiday invitations became rare, and when they did come, they arrived with subtle hints about keeping gifts simple and affordable. I'd played the role perfectly, wearing the same 3 outfits in rotation, buying generic groceries when they visited, apologizing for not being able to contribute more to Lance's birthday presents, all while my investment accounts grew steadily and my real estate portfolio expanded. The most painful part hadn't been their rejection of my supposed poverty. It had been watching how quickly they accepted it. No one questioned whether I needed help. No one offered to assist with my financial struggles. They simply wrote me off as a problem solved by distance and low expectations. Lyra, in particular, had embraced my new status with enthusiasm that bordered on cruelty. During family visits, she'd make comments about how some people needed to learn to live within their means. She'd suggest I shop at thrift stores, as if this was helpful advice rather than condescension. She'd even offered to teach me how to use coupons more effectively, apparently unaware that I'd been using them long before she was born. But it was the way she treated Lance's relationship with me that cut deepest. Gradually, systematically, she'd been teaching my grandson that I was less important than other family members, that my presence was tolerated rather than welcomed, that love and respect were commodities tied to financial contribution. "Nana can't come to your school play, honey," I'd overheard her tell Lance once. "She can't afford the gas money, and it would be awkward to ask." I could have easily afforded to fly to his school play and rent a hotel room afterward. Instead, I'd missed it, watching my grandson learn that economic circumstances determined family priorities. The really masterful part of Lyra's manipulation was how she framed it as protection. She was protecting me from embarrassment, from feeling bad about my limitations, from the stress of trying to keep up with their lifestyle. In reality, she was systematically erasing me from my grandson's life while appearing compassionate to anyone who might be watching. Kent, for his part, had simply allowed it to happen. When I tried to discuss Lance's increasing distance during our last phone conversation, he'd brushed off my concerns. "He's just busy with school and friends, Mom. Kids that age don't really want to hang out with grandparents anyway. It's normal. Normal. As if the gradual dissolution of a family bond was just part of natural development rather than the result of deliberate manipulation. But through it all, I'd watched and learned. I'd seen who they really were when they thought no one important was looking. I'd documented every slight, every dismissive comment, every moment when they chose convenience over compassion. Yesterday, when Lyra told Lance I wasn't his real grandmother, she'd provided the final piece of evidence I needed. Not just that she didn't respect me, but that she was actively working to poison my relationship with my grandson. Now, lying on this uncomfortable couch while my family slept peacefully in their comfortable beds, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 3 years: anticipation. Tonight, during dinner, the performance would end, the masks would come off, and everyone would finally see the truth. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my investment accounts, checking the morning numbers. 52 million now, thanks to some particularly good decisions in the renewable energy sector. More than enough to ensure Lance's future, regardless of his parents' financial planning skills. More than enough to rewrite the rules of this family entirely. From the kitchen, I could hear Lyra starting coffee, probably wondering why the old woman was taking so long to get off the couch and make herself useful. Little did she know that in less than 24 hours, she'd be the one wondering about her usefulness to this family. The thought made me smile as I finally forced myself upright and prepared to endure one more day of being treated like a burden I'd soon prove I'd never actually been. The morning passed with the usual family vacation rhythm. Kent buried himself in work emails while claiming to be relaxing. Lyra spent an hour getting ready to hike a mile-long trail, and Lance bounced between boredom and bursts of energy. I played my part, offering to clean up breakfast while apologizing for being slow. But something was different about me, and I could see that Lyra had begun to notice. "You seem energetic today," she said, watching me wash dishes with more efficiency than usual. Her tone carried that particular suspicion she reserved for anything that didn't fit her expectations. "I slept better than expected," I replied truthfully. The terrible mattress had actually felt like a luxury compared to the weight I'd been carrying for 3 years. Knowing that tonight would end the charade had given me a lightness I hadn't felt since Henry's funeral. When we finally set out for the lake hike, I surprised everyone by keeping pace easily. For 3 years, I'd been playing the role of a frail, aging woman who needed frequent rest stops and careful assistance. Today, I walked with the confidence of someone who'd been maintaining her health specifically for moments like this. "Nana, you're walking really fast," Lance observed, his small legs working to keep up with my suddenly brisk pace. "I feel good today, sweetheart," I told him, reaching down to squeeze his hand. Sometimes we surprise ourselves with what we're capable of. Kent looked back from his position ahead of us, confusion flickering across his face. "Mom, are you sure you're okay? You seem different." Different. If only he knew how different things were about to become. The lake was beautiful, surrounded by towering pines and reflecting the morning sun like scattered diamonds. Lance immediately began collecting interesting rocks while Kent and Lyra spread out their elaborate picnic setup. They'd brought a full cooler, portable chairs, and even a small speaker for music. Meanwhile, I'd been allocated a single water bottle and a granola bar, as if my needs were naturally minimal. I found myself studying each of them with new clarity, like an anthropologist observing fascinating but alien creatures. Kent sat in his expensive camping chair, alternating between his phone and worried glances in my direction. He'd inherited his father's height and my stubborn chin, but somewhere along the way, he'd lost the kindness I remembered from his childhood. When had he become someone who could so easily dismiss his own mother's welfare? When had he started measuring family loyalty in dollars and convenience? Lyra, on the other hand, was exactly who she'd always been. I'd just been too hopeful to see it clearly before. She lounged in her chair like a queen holding court, occasionally issuing instructions to Lance about staying away from the water's edge while making no effort to supervise him herself. Every few minutes, she'd take a selfie, carefully angling the camera to capture the scenic background while excluding me from the frame. "Lance, come take a picture with Mommy and Daddy," she called out, patting her lap with perfectly manicured nails. As they posed for their perfect family photo, I realized I'd never been included in a single one of their vacation pictures. For 3 years, I'd been the invisible woman, present but not worthy of documentation. Future generations looking through their photo albums would never know I'd been on these trips at all. The thought should have hurt, but instead, it amused me. By tomorrow, they'd be desperately trying to prove they'd always valued my presence. "Nana, want to see my rock collection?" Lance had abandoned the photo session and returned to my side, his small hands cupped around several smooth stones. "They're beautiful," I told him, examining each one with genuine interest. "You have excellent taste in rocks." He beamed at the compliment, settling beside me on the fallen log where I'd chosen to sit instead of asking for one of their premium chairs. For the next hour, we built elaborate rock castles and invented stories about the fish we could see swimming in the clear water. This was what I'd missed most during the 3 years of careful distance Lyra had orchestrated. Not the big family celebrations or holiday gatherings, but these simple moments of connection with my grandson. These were the memories that should have been forming naturally, consistently, instead of being rationed like scarce resources. "Lance seems really attached to you," Kent observed, finally putting away his phone and actually paying attention to his family. "We understand each other," I replied, helping Lance balance a particularly tricky rock on top of our castle. "It's sweet," Lyra added, though her tone suggested she found it anything but sweet. "Though I hope he's not becoming too dependent. Children need to learn that people can't always be there for them." The casual cruelty of the comment, delivered while Lance was right beside us, made my jaw clench. She was already preparing him for my eventual absence, laying the groundwork for cutting me out of his life entirely. "People should be able to depend on family," I said quietly, meeting her eyes directly. "That's what family means." Something in my tone must have caught her attention because her expression sharpened. "Well, yes, but within reason. People need to be realistic about what others can provide." "Absolutely," I agreed, smiling in a way that made her frown. People should definitely be realistic about what others can provide. The conversation moved on, but I could feel Lyra watching me more carefully for the rest of the afternoon. Her instincts were telling her something had shifted, though she couldn't identify exactly what. As we packed up to return to the cabin, I made my next strategic move. "I've been thinking," I announced, shouldering my small backpack with energy that surprised them. "We should have a special dinner tonight, a real family meal." "Mom, we already planned to order pizza," Kent said, looking tired from our short hike. "It's easier." "Oh, but I insist," I continued cheerfully. "I'd like to cook for everyone. It's the least I can do after you've all been so accommodating about including me in this vacation." Lyra's eyes narrowed. She'd grown accustomed to my apologetic gratitude, but there was something different in my tone now. Something that sounded almost like challenge. "You don't need to go to all that trouble," she said carefully. "Besides, the kitchen in the cabin is pretty small, not really set up for elaborate cooking." "I'll manage," I assured her. "I'm more resourceful than people give me credit for." That evening, as I stood in the cabin's tiny kitchen preparing what would be our last meal together as a deceived family, I felt a strange combination of sadness and anticipation. I was about to destroy the illusion of family unity that Kent and Lyra had constructed around their own convenience, but I was also about to free all of us from the lies we'd been living. "Smells good in here," Kent said, wandering into the kitchen as I put the finishing touches on a meal that had cost more than they knew. I'd driven to the expensive market in town earlier and purchased ingredients that reflected my actual budget rather than my supposed limitations. "I found some wonderful steaks on sale," I lied smoothly, "and I thought we deserved something special for our last night together." "Last night?" Lyra appeared in the doorway, her voice sharp with suspicion. "Of our vacation," I clarified, though we both knew that wasn't what I'd meant. As I called them to dinner, I felt the weight of 3 years of careful observation settling into place. Tonight, everything would change. The performance would end, the truth would emerge, and my family would discover exactly who they'd been dismissing. I looked around the small cabin one more time. memorizing this moment before everything shifted. By tomorrow, they'd understand that assumptions about power, money, and family loyalty could be dangerously wrong. The table was set, the food was ready, and Richard Morrison was standing by with all the legal documents that would reshape our family's future. As I called Lance to wash his hands for dinner, I smiled with genuine anticipation. It was time for the real conversation to begin. The dinner I'd prepared was worthy of a fine restaurant: prime ribeye steaks, roasted vegetables with herbs I'd grown myself before moving to my poverty apartment, and a chocolate dessert that had cost more than Lyra typically spent on groceries in a week. I watched their faces as they took their first bites, seeing surprise and confusion replace their usual patronizing acceptance of my simple cooking. "This is incredible, Mom," Kent said, cutting into his steak with appreciation. "When did you learn to cook like this?" "I've always cooked like this," I replied truthfully. "You just haven't been paying attention." Lance was attacking his child-sized portion with enthusiasm, chattering about how it was the best dinner ever. Lyra ate more slowly, her expression growing increasingly suspicious as she processed the quality and obvious expense of the meal. "Where did you get these steaks?" she asked finally, her tone casual but her eyes sharp. "They must have been expensive." "I found them on sale," I repeated my earlier lie, meeting her gaze steadily. "Sometimes you get lucky." "Lucky," she repeated, clearly not believing me. "Right." I set down my fork and reached for the wine I'd opened earlier, another expensive choice that hadn't gone unnoticed. The cheap box wine I usually brought to family gatherings was nowhere in sight tonight. "Actually," I said, feeling the moment crystallize around us, "I think it's time we talked about luck and money and honesty." Kent paused mid-chew, something in my tone alerting him that this wasn't going to be a typical family dinner conversation. Lyra's hand tightened around her wine glass, her instincts clearly screaming warnings she couldn't yet interpret. "What do you mean, Nana?" Lance asked innocently, looking up from his steak with trusting eyes. "I mean, sweetheart, that sometimes adults don't tell each other the whole truth, and sometimes that causes problems." "Mom," Kent said carefully, setting down his utensils, "what are you getting at?" I took a slow sip of wine, savoring both the excellent vintage and the moment I'd been anticipating for 3 years. "I'm getting at the fact that you've all been operating under some significant misunderstandings about my situation." "Your situation?" Lyra's voice had gone up half an octave, the way it did when she sensed a threat to her carefully managed world. "My financial situation, specifically." I smiled at her, enjoying the way her face was beginning to pale. "You see, when Henry died, you all made some assumptions about what he left behind, about what I had to live on, about what kind of future I was facing." Kent was staring at me now, his dinner forgotten. "Mom, what are you saying? "I'm saying that your father and I were much better with money than any of you realized." I reached into my purse and pulled out a tablet, opening it to the summary page of my investment portfolio. Much, much better. The screen showed a number that made Kent's mouth fall open. $52,347,891. That's impossible," Lyra whispered, leaning forward to stare at the screen as if it might be some kind of magic trick. "The investments are real," I said calmly. "The real estate holdings are real. The trust accounts are real. The only thing that wasn't real was the poverty I've been performing for the past 3 years." Kent's chair scraped against the floor as he pushed back from the table. "Performing? Mom, what the hell are you talking about?" "I'm talking about a test," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "A 3-year test to see who you really were when you thought I had nothing to offer you except need." The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear Lance's breathing, the tick of the wall clock, the distant sound of wind through the pine trees outside. But inside the cabin, 3 people were processing the complete destruction of everything they thought they knew about their family dynamics. Lyra was the first to break. "You're lying," she said, her voice shrill with panic. "This is some kind of joke, some kind of cruel joke." "No joke," I assured her, scrolling through the account pages to show them the real estate holdings. the stock portfolios, the municipal bonds. Although I suppose there's some irony in you calling something cruel, but the apartment, Kent stammered, the constant money worries, the way what? I asked pointedly. The way I accepted being treated like a burden? The way I allowed myself to be excluded from family gatherings because I supposedly couldn't afford to contribute? The way I sat quietly while Lyra explained to my grandson that I wasn't really part of this family? Kent's face went white. He glanced at his wife, who was now openly staring at the tablet screen as if she could make the numbers disappear through sheer force of will. "You've been testing us," he said slowly, realization dawning in his voice. "For 3 years, you've been testing us." "And you failed," I said simply. "Spectacularly." Lyra suddenly stood up, her chair toppling backward with a crash. "This is insane. You can't just lie to your family for 3 years and then act like we're the villains." "Can I?" I asked, remaining seated while she loomed over the table. "Because from where I'm sitting, I simply allowed you to reveal who you really were when you thought there was nothing in it for you." "We took care of you," she shouted, her composure completely shattered now. "We included you in vacations. We called. We visited." "You warehoused me," I corrected firmly. "You managed me like an unpleasant obligation. You systematically excluded me from meaningful family moments while congratulating yourselves on doing the bare minimum." Lance was looking back and forth between the adults with growing alarm. "Why is everyone yelling? Nana, why is Mom so upset?" I reached over and took his small hand in mine. "Sometimes adults have disagreements about important things, sweetheart. But don't worry. Everything is going to be fine." "Everything is not going to be fine." Lyra's voice cracked with hysteria. "You've been lying to us. You've been manipulating us." "I've been observing you," I said coldly. "And what I observed was that when you thought I was poor and needy, you couldn't get rid of me fast enough. You treated me like a burden, excluded me from family decisions, and worst of all, you started teaching Lance that loving someone was conditional on what they could provide." Kent finally found his voice. "Mom, if you had just told us—" "Told you what?" I interrupted. "That I had money? And then what? You would have suddenly remembered how to treat me with respect? You would have magically developed affection for me again? You would have stopped allowing your wife to poison my grandson against me?" The word poison hit Lyra like a physical blow. She stumbled backward, her hand reaching for the wall to steady herself. I never—" she started, but the words died in her throat as she realized there was no defense for what she'd done. "Yesterday," I continued relentlessly, "when you told Lance that I wasn't his real grandmother, you confirmed everything I'd suspected about your character. You're not just someone who treats people differently based on their perceived value. You're someone who actively works to destroy relationships that don't serve your purposes." Lyra's breathing was becoming rapid and shallow, her face cycling through shades of white and red as the full implications of the situation hit her. I think I'm going to be sick." And then, as if the universe had decided to provide the perfect punctuation to my revelation, she did exactly what I'd never expected, but would remember forever. She fainted. Lyra crumpled to the floor like a marionette with cut strings, her body hitting the cabin's wooden floor with a dull thud that seemed to echo through the sudden silence. Kent rushed to her side, kneeling beside his unconscious wife, while Lance stared in shock. "Mom, Lyra, can you hear me?" I remained seated at the table, calmly finishing my wine while my daughter-in-law lay unconscious on the floor. After 3 years of carefully orchestrated humiliation, I felt nothing but satisfaction watching her world collapse around her. "Is she okay?" Lance asked, his voice small and frightened. "She'll be fine," I assured him, though honestly I didn't much care either way. Sometimes people get overwhelmed when they realize they've made serious mistakes. Kent looked up at me from where he knelt beside Lyra, his expression a mixture of shock, anger, and something that might have been the beginning of understanding. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. I smiled, taking another sip of my excellent wine. Now? Now we have an honest conversation about the future. Once your wife wakes up, of course. The test was complete. The results were conclusive. And the real conversation about our family's future was just beginning. Lyra regained consciousness 10 minutes later, her eyes fluttering open to find Kent hovering over her with a damp towel, and Lance peering around his father's shoulder with concern. I had moved to the living room, giving them space while maintaining my position of calm authority. "What happened?" she mumbled, trying to sit up before the memory crashed back over her. Her eyes immediately found me across the room, and I watched the hope die in her expression as she realized it hadn't been a nightmare. "You fainted," Kent said gently, helping her to a seated position against the kitchen cabinets. "When Mom showed us, when she told us about the money," Lyra finished flatly, her voice hollow. "She really has $50 million. $52 million, I corrected from my comfortable position on the couch. As of this morning's market close, the precision of the number seemed to hit her like another physical blow. This wasn't vague wealth or family money tied up in complicated trusts. This was liquid, accessible, life-changing wealth that I'd possessed all along while watching them treat me like a charity case." Kent helped Lyra to her feet and guided her to one of the kitchen chairs. Lance had retreated to his toy cars, sensing the adult tension, but not understanding its source. The sight of my grandson playing quietly while his world shifted around him made my chest tight with protective anger. "I need to understand," Kent said, settling into the chair across from his wife while keeping his eyes fixed on me. "You've had this money for 3 years. You watched us struggle with decisions about your care, about including you in family events, about—" He stopped, the full scope of my deception hitting him. "You let us think you were poor." "I let you reveal who you really were," I corrected firmly. "I didn't make you treat me badly, Kent. I simply gave you the opportunity to show your true character when you thought there were no consequences." Lyra's hands were shaking as she reached for her water glass. "But why? Why would you do this to us?" The question was so genuinely bewildered that I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. "Because I needed to know," I said simply. "When Henry died, I realized I didn't actually know my own family anymore. I needed to understand who you'd become, who you'd marry, and most importantly, what kind of people would be influencing my grandson's understanding of family loyalty." "So you lied to us for 3 years," Kent said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "You manipulated us, tested us, set us up to fail." "I observed you," I replied coldly. "Everything you did, every choice you made, every way you treated me was entirely your decision. I simply didn't correct your assumptions about my financial situation." Lyra suddenly leaned forward, her eyes bright with desperate calculation. "But now that we know, everything can be different. We can start over. We can—" "No," I cut her off firmly. "We cannot start over. You can't unknow who you really are, and I can't forget what I've learned about both of you." The finality in my tone seemed to drain the last bit of color from her face. "What does that mean?" And I reached into my purse and pulled out a thick manila envelope, setting it on the coffee table where they could all see it. "It means that I've made some decisions about the future, about my will, about my assets, and about my relationship with this family." Kent's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. "Mom, whatever you're thinking—" "I'm not thinking, Kent. I've already done it." I opened the envelope and pulled out the first document, a revised will that my attorney had prepared according to my exact specifications. My estate will be held in trust for Lance until his 25th birthday. The trustees will be my attorney and a financial management company, not family members. Lyra made a sound like air being let out of a balloon. "You're cutting us out completely?" "I'm ensuring that Lance has the resources he'll need for his future, regardless of his parents' financial planning abilities or character development." I pulled out the second document. "However, there are conditions." "Conditions?" Kent asked warily. "The trust can only be accessed if Lance maintains a relationship with me that isn't mediated or controlled by his parents. If I find that either of you has poisoned him against me, has prevented him from seeing me, or has in any way damaged our relationship, the money goes to charity instead." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear Lance's toy cars rolling across the wooden floor in the next room. "You can't do that," Lyra whispered, though her voice suggested she knew I absolutely could. "I can, and I have," I confirmed. "Additionally, I've established a fund for Lance's education, healthcare, and general welfare that will be administered independently. You won't have access to it, but you also won't be financially responsible for major expenses." Kent was staring at the documents as if they were written in a foreign language. "You're basically bribing us to let you have a relationship with Lance." "I'm protecting myself and my grandson from your demonstrated willingness to cut people out of family relationships when it suits your convenience," I corrected sharply. "You spent 3 years systematically reducing my role in Lance's life. Now you'll spend the next 17 years ensuring that doesn't happen again." Lyra's breathing was becoming shallow again, and I wondered idly if she might faint a second time. "This is blackmail. This is consequences," I said firmly. "For 3 years, you operated under the assumption that I had no power, no resources, and no options. You were wrong on all counts." I pulled out the third document, the one that I knew would hurt Kent the most. "I've also made some decisions about more immediate arrangements." "What kind of arrangements?" he asked, though his tone suggested he didn't really want to know. "I'm moving. The apartment I've been renting is actually a property I own, but it was never meant to be permanent. I've purchased a house about 2 hours from here, close enough for regular visits with Lance but far enough to maintain my independence." 2 hours? Kent's voice cracked slightly. "Mom, that's far enough that you'll have to make a real effort if you want to see me," I finished. "No more obligatory dinners where I'm treated like an unwelcome guest. No more family vacations where I sleep on pull-out couches while being grateful for the privilege. If you want a relationship with me, you'll have to earn it." Lyra finally found her voice, though it sounded like it was coming from very far away. "What if we don't agree to your conditions?" I smiled at her, the expression containing no warmth whatsoever. "Then Lance will still inherit everything when he turns 25, but you'll have spent nearly 2 decades knowing that your treatment of his grandmother cost your family $52 million. The weight of that statement settled over them like a lead blanket. I could practically see the calculations running through their minds, the desperate scrambling to find some angle, some approach that might salvage the situation. "You said you wanted to protect Lance from learning that love was conditional," Kent said desperately. "But isn't that exactly what you're doing?" "What? Making your love conditional on how we treat you?" "No," I replied calmly. "I'm making my money conditional on how you treat me. My love for Lance has never wavered, despite your best efforts to damage our relationship. But my willingness to financially support people who have demonstrated their disdain for me, that ship has sailed." I stood up, smoothing my dress and preparing to deliver the final blow. "You have a choice to make. You can accept these new terms and rebuild our family relationships on a foundation of genuine respect, or you can reject them and explain to Lance when he's older why his college fund was donated to charity instead of invested in his future." Lyra was openly crying now, tears streaming down her face as the full scope of her miscalculation became clear. "We didn't know," she sobbed. "If we had known about the money. If you had known about the money, you would have treated me well for exactly the wrong reasons," I finished. "You would have been kind to me because I was useful, not because I was family. That's not love, Lyra. That's manipulation." Kent was holding his head in his hands, the magnitude of their situation finally sinking in. 3 years of dismissing his mother, of allowing his wife to systematically exclude her from family life, of treating her like a burden to be managed rather than a person to be loved. "What do you want from us?" he asked finally, his voice muffled by his hands. "I want you to decide who you want to be," I said simply. "You can be the kind of people who love family members regardless of their financial status. Or you can be the kind of people who measure relationships by their profit potential. But you can't be both, and you can't pretend the past 3 years didn't happen." I walked to the window and looked out at the lake where Lance and I had built rock castles just hours earlier. Tomorrow, we would drive home separately. They would return to their regular life with the knowledge that everything had changed, and I would begin the process of building something new. I'll give you tonight to discuss it, I said without turning around. In the morning, you can let me know what you've decided. Behind me, I could hear Lyra's quiet sobbing and Kent's whispered attempts to comfort her, but I felt no sympathy for their distress. They had created this situation with their choices, their assumptions, and their casual cruelty. Now they would have to live with the consequences. I woke up the next morning to the sound of hushed, frantic whispers coming from Kent and Lyra's bedroom. They'd been up most of the night, and from the bits of conversation that drifted through the thin cabin walls, I gathered they were still trying to find some angle that would restore their position of power. There wasn't one. Lance was already awake, sitting at the small kitchen table with a bowl of cereal, swinging his legs and humming quietly to himself. He looked up when I emerged from my uncomfortable couch, his smile as bright and uncomplicated as ever. "Morning, Nana. Are we going home today?" "We are, sweetheart," I said, ruffling his hair as I passed by to make coffee. "Are you excited to see your room again?" "I guess. But I liked building rock castles with you yesterday. Can we do that again sometime?" The simple question made my throat tight with emotion. "I hope so, Lance. I really hope so." Kent appeared in the doorway, looking like he'd aged 5 years overnight. His hair was disheveled, his eyes were bloodshot, and he moved with the careful precision of someone trying to hold himself together. "Mom," he said quietly, "can we talk?" I glanced at Lance, who was absorbed in his cereal and seemingly oblivious to the adult tension surrounding him. Of course, we stepped onto the porch, the morning air crisp and clean in a way that felt symbolic. The mountain lake stretched out before us, peaceful and unchanging, indifferent to the human drama that had unfolded in its shadow. "We want to accept your terms," Kent said without preamble, his voice hoarse from exhaustion and emotion. I studied his face, looking for signs of genuine understanding versus desperate calculation. "All of them? All of them." He rubbed his face with both hands. "Lyra's not happy about it, but she understands we don't have a choice." "This isn't about choice, Kent," I said firmly. "This is about character. If you're only accepting my terms because you feel trapped, then we're not building anything real." He was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the water. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I failed you, didn't I? As a son, I completely failed you." The admission hit me harder than I'd expected. This was what I'd been waiting 3 years to hear. But now that the moment had arrived, I felt no triumph. Only sadness for the relationship we'd lost, and uncertainty about whether it could be rebuilt. "You failed yourself," I said gently. "You became someone I didn't recognize. Someone who could watch his wife systematically exclude his mother from family life and say nothing. Someone who could hear his child being taught that love was conditional and not intervene." Tears were running down his face now, and I was reminded suddenly of the little boy who used to cry when he accidentally stepped on bugs in the garden. That child had possessed an innate kindness that somewhere, somehow, had gotten buried under years of Lyra's influence and his own choices. "Can you forgive me?" he asked, the question raw with genuine remorse. "I can learn to forgive you," I said carefully. "But forgiveness doesn't erase consequences." "The past 3 years happened, Kent. The way you treated me, the way you allowed me to be treated, the damage done to my relationship with Lance. Those things are real." He nodded, accepting the weight of what he'd done. "What do we do now?" "Now you prove that you mean what you're saying. Not through grand gestures or dramatic apologies, but through consistent, respectful behavior over time. You show me that you remember I'm your mother, not a burden to be managed. And Lyra?" I looked through the screen door to where I could see his wife sitting at the kitchen table, her face puffy from crying and her hands wrapped around a coffee mug like it was an anchor. She was staring at nothing, clearly trying to process a world where she no longer held all the power in family relationships. "Lyra will have to decide who she wants to be," I said honestly. "She can learn to treat me with respect, or she can continue to see me as an obstacle to her perfect family vision. But she can't do both, and her choice will determine what kind of relationship she has with the money that will shape Lance's future." Kent winced at the blunt reminder of the financial stakes involved. "She's scared." "She should be," I replied without sympathy. She spent 3 years systematically trying to erase me from my grandson's life while treating me like hired help. Fear is an appropriate response to realizing that her actions have consequences. We stood in silence for a moment, watching Lance through the window as he finished his breakfast and wandered over to the toy box in the corner of the living room. His innocence in the midst of our family's upheaval was both heartbreaking and motivating. "I want him to know his grandmother," Kent said suddenly. "The real you, not the version Lyra's been teaching him to see." "Then you'll have to actively work to make that happen," I told him. "No more passive acceptance when Lyra makes cutting remarks about me. No more allowing her to exclude me from family decisions or events. No more treating my presence like a favor you're doing me instead of a relationship that benefits everyone." "I understand. I hope you do," I said, meaning it sincerely. "Because this is your last chance, Kent. I won't spend another 3 years being treated like a second-class family member while pretending it doesn't hurt." 6 months later, I was sitting in the sunroom of my new house, watching Lance help me tend to the herb garden we'd planted together. The 2-hour drive had indeed proven far enough to require real effort for visits, which meant that when they came, the time felt intentional rather than obligatory. Kent visited every other weekend, sometimes bringing Lyra, sometimes coming alone when she was too busy to make the trip. I suspected these solo visits were his way of rebuilding our relationship without the complication of his wife's resentment, and I appreciated the effort. Lyra's adjustment to our new dynamic had been painful to watch, but necessary to witness. She'd tried various approaches: sullen compliance, fake enthusiasm, strategic absences, before finally settling into a pattern of cautious politeness that felt sustainable, if not warm. "She's never going to like me," I'd told Kent during one of his solo visits. "Probably not," he'd agreed honestly. "But she's learning to respect you, and that might be enough." It was enough, I'd decided. I wasn't interested in fake friendship or forced affection. I wanted acknowledgement of my place in the family hierarchy and treatment that reflected my value as Lance's grandmother and Kent's mother. Lyra could provide that without liking me, and I could accept it without trusting her. The real victory was Lance. Free from his mother's subtle poisoning against me, our relationship had blossomed into something deeper and more genuine than I'd dared hope. He spent every other weekend with me, learning to cook my recipes, helping with my garden, and absorbing stories about his grandfather and the family history Lyra had never bothered to ask about. "Nana," he said now, carefully transplanting a basil seedling, "Mom says you're really rich. Is that true?" I smiled at his directness. 8-year-olds had no patience for adult euphemisms. "I am, sweetheart. Does that change anything between us?" He considered this seriously, the way he approached all important questions. "I don't think so. You're still the same person who builds rock castles and makes the best pancakes. Money doesn't change that, right?" "Right," I agreed, my heart swelling with love for this wise little boy. "Money doesn't change who we are inside. It just sometimes reveals who other people really are." He nodded solemnly, then brightened as a new thought occurred to him. "Does this mean I can go to college wherever I want?" "It means you'll have options," I told him. "But you'll still have to work hard and make good choices. Money can open doors, but you're the one who has to walk through them." That evening, after Kent had picked up Lance and started the drive back to their house, I settled into my favorite chair with a cup of tea and the satisfaction of a day well spent. My phone buzzed with a text from Kent. "Thank you for today. Lance hasn't stopped talking about the garden. Same time in 2 weeks?" I typed back. "Of course. Drive safely." The relationship wasn't perfect. It might never be what it could have been if the past 3 years had gone differently. But it was honest now, built on a foundation of truth rather than assumption, respect rather than obligation. I thought about Lyra, probably spending her evening calculating the compound interest on $52 million, and wondering what her life might have looked like if she'd made different choices. The irony wasn't lost on me that in trying to exclude me from the family, she'd inadvertently ensured her own permanent outsider status. But mostly, I thought about Lance and the man he would become. He would grow up knowing that family relationships required effort and respect to maintain. He would understand that wealth was a tool, not a measure of worth. Most importantly, He would know that his grandmother had fought to remain part of his life when others tried to push her aside. The test was over. The results were permanent. And for the first time in 3 years, I was exactly where I belonged. In my own home, on my own terms, with my dignity intact, and my future secure. Outside my window, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to build the family relationships I wanted, rather than simply accepting the ones others tried to impose on me. I raised my teacup in a silent toast to my 70-year-old self, the woman who had finally learned that sometimes the greatest victory is simply refusing to be diminished by other people's limitations. The performance was over. The truth had set us all free, and I had never been happier to be exactly who I was. Now, I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.